In 2010, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter Bill Dedman discovered something impossible. 3 palatial estates, perfectly maintained, costing hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. Furniture carefully covered, gardens meticulously trimmed, staff arriving daily to polish and preserve. The owner had not visited in decades. Some properties had never been visited at all. The estates belonged to Huguette Clark, age 104, one of the richest women in America. Her main residence sat on 23 acres overlooking the Pacific in Santa Barbara, California. 22,000 square feet of French chateau elegance called Bellosguardo. When Dedman visited, the caretaker asked a question that seemed absurd. "Do you think she's still alive?" She was alive, but she was not living in any of her mansions. Huguette Clark was living in a hospital room. She had checked into Doctors Hospital in Manhattan in 1991 for a routine procedure. The treatment succeeded. Her doctor urged her to go home. She refused. For the next 20 years, she paid hundreds of thousands of dollars annually to remain in a simple room overlooking Central Park. Meanwhile, her estate sat frozen in time. Cars wore 1949 license plates. Dishes had been washed and dated in the 90s, then stored. Linens had been wrapped in brown paper and signed in the 60s. The question everyone asked was simple. Why would one of America's wealthiest heiresses choose a hospital room over palaces? To understand how one woman could own such beauty and refuse to see it, you have to go back to where the money came from, the scandal, the copper, and a man who believed he could buy anything, including a seat in the United States Senate. If stories of Gilded Age fortunes, family secrets, and the mysterious choices of America's wealthiest fascinate you, you're going to want to hear what happens next. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below, and if you enjoy deep dives into history's most intriguing estates, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what comes next. Chapter 1. The Copper King. The money that built Bellosguardo did not come from old family wealth or inherited titles. It came from ruthlessness, copper, and a man who stood 5 feet 8 inches tall with unruly red hair and eyes like ice. William Andrews Clark was born on January 8, 1839, in a log cabin in Connellsville, Pennsylvania. There was nothing aristocratic about his origins, nothing refined. When his family moved to Iowa in 1856, young William taught school and studied law, but classrooms could not hold him. In 1863, during the Montana Gold Rush, Clark arrived in Bannock with almost nothing. He worked placer claims and extracted $1,500 worth of gold. That modest sum became the nucleus of an immense fortune. Clark understood something his fellow miners did not. There was more money in supplying miners than in mining itself. He hauled eggs and tobacco from Salt Lake City to the boomtowns, transported mail, and opened a bank in Deer Lodge. When miners could not repay their loans, he took their claims. Little by little, Clark accumulated property that others had lost. By the 1870s, he had struck copper in Butte, Montana. The timing was perfect. America's cities were electrifying, and copper wire was suddenly worth more than gold. Clark built smelters, bought electric power companies, purchased newspapers, and expanded into railroads. He was not just wealthy, he was one of the copper kings, men who controlled the metal that powered the modern world. At one point, Clark operated the largest mining concern on Earth. His business methods were as hard as the rock he extracted. When rival Marcus Daly needed water for his new smelter, Daly discovered that Clark had already bought up the water rights. That kind of foresight made Clark rich. It also made him hated. A contemporary observer wrote that Clark had quote, _1 _ are unlike his peers, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan. Clark never softened his image with philanthropy. He built no libraries, endowed no universities, created no foundations. When asked about his responsibility to future generations during a Senate hearing, Clark replied, quote 2, by 1907, his fortune was estimated at $150 million, roughly equivalent to $31 billion today. Senator Robert La Follette called him one of the 100 men who owned America. Mark Twain was less generous. He described Clark as, quote 3, Twain was referring to the scandal that made Clark nationally infamous. Clark craved political power as much as wealth. In 1890, he ran for the United States Senate and lost. He ran again in 1893 and lost again. Montana's legislature chose senators in those days, not voters, and Clark's rival Marcus Daly controlled too many legislators. Clark, however, was patient, and he had cash. On December 4th, 1899, Clark finally won a Senate seat. The price was more than $330,000 in bribes. His son coordinated the scheme, distributing envelopes stuffed with money to state legislators. Some received $240, others received $100,000. The bribes ranged from paid mortgages to purchased ranches to direct cash payments. The envelopes, carefully preserved, still exist in the National Archives. When investigators exposed the fraud, the Senate refused to seat him. Witnesses testified that Clark had violated an 1895 Montana law limiting campaign spending to $2,000. Clark was forced to resign on May 15, 1900, before the Senate could formally expel him. Years later, a statement attributed to Clark became famous. Quote 4. After rival Marcus Daly died in November 1900, Clark ran again. This time, he won cleanly and served a single term from 1901 to 1907. The scandal followed him to Washington. Colleagues avoided him. The press mocked him. His bribery case eventually led to the 17th Amendment, which mandated the direct election of senators. Clark had accidentally reformed the Constitution. Wealth, however, required display, and Clark was ready to build monuments to himself that would shock even the Gilded Age. The largest would rise on Fifth Avenue in New York, and when it was finished, even his critics would have to look up. Chapter 2. Clark's Folly. In 1897, William Clark commissioned the architectural firm of Lord Hewlett and Hull to design a mansion on Fifth Avenue at 77th Street. The original plans, drafted by French architect Henri Deglaine, estimated construction costs at $415,000. Clark deemed them insufficient. In 1901, he ordered the plans expanded and revised, raising the budget to $2.5 million. By the time the mansion was completed in 1911, the true cost had reached $7 million, equivalent to $236 million today. To build the house, Clark bought a granite quarry in New Hampshire for $50,000 and constructed a railroad to transport the stone to Manhattan. He purchased a bronze foundry and employed 200 men to produce metalwork. Oak panels were imported from Sherwood Forest in England. One panel, Clark insisted, bore an iron stain from a ring where Robin Hood had tied his horse. Marble arrived from Italy. Pieces of a French chateau were disassembled, shipped across the Atlantic, and reassembled inside the New York mansion. The finished structure rose 9 stories and contained 121 rooms. 26 of those rooms were for servants. There were 31 bathrooms, 4 art galleries, a swimming pool, and Turkish baths built underground. The house featured 11 elevators and the largest chamber organ in America, housed in a loft with 4,000 pipes. To heat the mansion, a private underground rail line delivered 7 tons of coal daily. The second floor featured a 36-foot-high rotunda used as a statuary room. It opened onto a conservatory of solid brass and glass that measured 30 feet high and 22 feet wide. Across the rotunda sat a marble-paneled art gallery, stretching 95 feet long and rising 2 stories. In the banquet room, a Numidian marble fireplace measured 15 feet across, flanked by life-size carved figures of Diana and Neptune. The breakfast room alone contained 170 carved panels, no 2 identical. The architectural record was not impressed. In a column titled Architectural Aberrations, critic Montgomery Schuyler wrote that the house would have been an appropriate residence for the late P.T. Barnum. He found the tower meaningless and fatuous, and suggested the rounded rustication on the first floor resembled the prototype of a log house. The New York Times called it a pile of granite. By the time the final ornament was attached, the French Beaux Arts style had already fallen out of fashion. Clark had spent 14 years building a monument that was obsolete before completion. He moved in anyway. For the next 14 years, Clark lived surrounded by medieval tapestries, imported artwork, and enough marble to build a small palace. He entertained rarely. His second wife, Anna, avoided society. Their two young daughters, Andrée and Huguette, grew up in rooms so grand they could barely comprehend them. On March 2, 1925, William Andrews Clark died of pneumonia at age 86. He died inside his marble citadel, one of the richest men in America, leaving an estate valued at over $200 million. His art collection, worth nearly $3 million, was offered to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The museum declined, unwilling to guarantee the perpetual display Clark's will demanded. The mansion would fall soon. Before it did, it housed a daughter who learned a different lesson about wealth. She learned to hide from it. Shortly after Clark's death, his widow Anna and daughter Huguette sold the property to developer Anthony Campagna for $3 million, less than half the construction cost. The sale price reflected a harsh truth. The mansion's substance, its massive marble walls and steel frame, was an encumbrance, not an asset. Dismantling the structure was so difficult that the majority of the $3 million went toward the land itself. In 1927, the mansion was demolished. A 12-story luxury apartment building designed by Rosario Candela rose in its place. The Salon Doré, a gilded room from the mansion, was bequeathed to the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington. Everything else vanished. Chapter 3. The Scandalous Marriage. While Clark's first wife had been respectable, his second was a scandal waiting to be discovered. Anna Eugenia La Chapelle was born in 1878 in Michigan to French-Canadian immigrants. How she met William Clark remains disputed, but contemporary newspaper accounts emphasized one uncomfortable fact. After Anna's father died, Clark became her guardian. He, quote, 10-1 article explained, quote 11. Clark sent the teenage Anna to Paris to study harp. When they married, allegedly in Europe in 1901, Anna was 23 years old. William was 62. The marriage was not announced publicly until 1904, and even then the news was buried on page 6 of Clark's rival newspaper, the Anaconda Standard. The age gap alone would have raised eyebrows. The guardian-to-wife progression scandalized polite society. Anna, however, proved remarkably suited to her peculiar position. She was beautiful, musically talented, and utterly uninterested in social ambition. William Clark once wrote of her, "Mrs. Clark did not care for social distinction, nor the obligations that would entail upon my public life. She spoke French with her daughters and avoided the society events that other wealthy wives pursued relentlessly." In a world of conspicuous display, Anna preferred privacy. The couple had two daughters. Louise Amelia Andrée Clark was born in 1902. Huguette Marcel Clark arrived on June 9, 1906, in Paris, in the family's apartment on Avenue Victor Hugo in the 16th arrondissement. The girls were raised in extreme wealth but relative seclusion. They spoke French and English fluently, traveled extensively, and lived surrounded by art, music, and servants. Huguette was educated at the Spence School in Manhattan after the family moved to New York when she was 5 years old. Tragedy struck in 1919. Andrée contracted meningitis and died 1 week before her 17th birthday. The loss devastated the family. Huguette, then 13 years old, would carry the grief for the rest of her life. Years later, she memorialized her sister by donating $50,000 to the city of Santa Barbara to excavate a saltwater pond and create an artificial freshwater lake. She stipulated that it be named the Andrée Clark Bird Refuge. When William Clark died in March 1925 inside his Fifth Avenue palace, he left behind $200 million and two women who wanted nothing to do with society. Anna, now 47, and Huguette, 19, moved 5 minutes down the avenue to a building at 907. They were downsizing. The new apartment had only 42 rooms. Chapter 4. The Gilded Cage. Most people would not call 42 rooms a downgrade. For Anna and Huguette Clark, however, the move from 121 rooms to 42 represented a deliberate retreat. The building at 907 Fifth Avenue had been designed in 1915 by architect J.E.R. Carpenter, a man later called, quote, 13 in New York City. The structure was an Italian Renaissance palazzo built around a central court, with lightly rusticated lower floors and deep quoins, carrying the detail up to a boldly projecting cornice. When it opened, the building boasted the most expensive apartments in the city. Herbert L. Pratt, a Standard Oil vice president, rented the entire 12th floor, 25 rooms, for $30,000 a year. Anna and Huguette initially took that same 12th floor apartment. The space was enormous by any standard except the one they had left behind. High ceilings, expansive windows overlooking Central Park, and enough rooms to house a significant household staff. The building had the aspect of permanence and dignity that wealthy New Yorkers expected. Oil barons, stock exchange presidents, and even a Russian prince lived there. The old telephone exchange was Butterfield 8, a detail that would remain unchanged for decades. After Huguette's brief marriage ended in 1930, she returned to her mother and began expanding. She eventually acquired 3 separate apartments. The entire 8th floor and half of the 12th gave her a total of 15,000 square feet. There was a 30-foot library, a 40-foot drawing room, a 40-foot living room, and a 17-foot ceiling art studio where Huguette could paint in natural light. Despite all that space, Huguette chose to live in the maids' quarters. She installed a small kitchenette and spent her days in a modest room at the end of a long hallway. The walls of the larger apartments were covered with Impressionist paintings: Monet, Renoir, Degas, Sargent. Her shoe collection was carefully organized, and slowly, steadily, her doll collection began to grow. Anna and Huguette lived together in a kind of genteel isolation. They employed a housekeeper, maids, and a chauffeur, but their social life was minimal. By the late 1930s, Huguette had disappeared from the society pages entirely. Mother and daughter spoke French to each other and to the staff, partly out of habit and partly, some believed, for fear of being overheard by outsiders. The pattern was set: 2 women, alone together, protected and isolated by millions. They had lived through 2 world wars and the Great Depression without their wealth ever being seriously threatened. Now they wanted only quiet. Society, however, demanded one more performance. Chapter 5. Bellosguardo. In 1923, William Clark purchased Paradise. The property sat on 23 acres of prime California coastline, overlooking the Pacific Ocean in Santa Barbara. The Graham family, who had made their fortune in oil, had built a lavish villa there in 1902 and named it Bellosguardo, quote 14 in Italian. The estate commanded 360-degree views of the ocean, the city, and the Santa Ynez Mountains. It had 1,000 feet of ocean frontage and was so thoroughly hidden by trees that you had to fly over the property to see it from above. 2 years after William bought Bellosguardo, he died. Then, in 1925, the original mansion was damaged in the Santa Barbara earthquake. Anna Clark, now a widow, made a bold decision. She would not simply repair the house. She would replace it entirely. She hired Reginald Davis Johnson, one of California's most refined architects, who had also designed the nearby Santa Barbara Biltmore. Johnson created a sweeping 18th-century French chateau that blended Beaux-Arts elegance with California coastal clarity. The design was symmetrical, formal, and unmistakably European. Construction was completed in 1933, and the result was magnificent. The mansion stretched more than 22,000 square feet and contained 27 rooms arranged in a U-shaped structure. Inside, every detail reflected Anna's vision of European refinement. The high-ceilinged foyer opened onto a main hall that stretched toward each wing, revealing views of a reflecting pool surrounded by 80-year-old orange trees. 2 rooms had been transported from the Clark family's New York properties and installed at Bellosguardo. The reception room featured exquisite wood paneling and a painted muslin ceiling. The dining room was dominated by a painted canvas ceiling and antique chairs arranged around a massive table. Huguette's private wing was designed for solitude and creativity. Her painting studio featured 17-foot ceilings and a loft where she could store her canvases. A private kitchenette and a back stairway led up to her bedroom and sitting room, ensuring she could move through her own space without encountering anyone else. Her dressing room even included chairs sized for her growing collection of French and Japanese dolls. Outside, The grounds were equally impressive. Anna's circular rose garden contained hundreds of bushes, each variety carefully recorded and its location mapped. Formal gardens stretched across the property, framed by sculptural hedges and mature cypress trees that lined dramatic pathways. A rustic thatched roof cottage on the property was renamed Andrée's cottage in memory of Huguette's sister. The carriage house stored the family's automobiles, which would remain there untouched for decades. Their license plates still read 1949 when reporters finally saw them, 60 years later. In August 1928, Huguette married William MacDonald Gower at Bellosguardo in a private ceremony. The wedding drew coverage from society pages across the country. It would be one of the last major family gatherings at the estate. Over the next 2 decades, the family visited occasionally, but the intervals grew longer. The California sunshine, the Pacific views, the carefully tended gardens, all of it waited for owners who came less and less frequently. By the early 1950s, visits had stopped entirely. When Anna died in 1963 and Huguette inherited the property, she gave the staff 2 simple instructions. Keep everything in first-class condition. Make no changes. For the next 48 years, those instructions were followed to the letter. Furniture was covered with custom coverings and carefully labeled. An estate manager lived on the grounds with his dogs, and a tame family of foxes made their home near the reflecting pool, hunting lizards in the California sun. The only human residents were the workers who arrived each day to maintain a house no one visited. The most beautiful estate on the California coast stood empty for nearly 60 years. Its owner, however, was watching cartoons in a hospital bed 3,000 miles away. Chapter 6. The Marriage That Never Was. The wedding at Bellosguardo had been perfect. The marriage was not. In December 1927, Huguette Clark announced her engagement to William MacDonald Gower, a Princeton University graduate and law student. Gower was the son of one of her father's business associates, which gave the match an air of respectability. Society pages celebrated the union. One newspaper declared that no married couple ever started married life under more brilliant auspices. The setting for their August 1928 wedding, Bellosguardo, with its ocean views and manicured gardens, was as picturesque as a postcard. The marriage lasted 9 months. Huguette and William separated in 1929, just 1 year after the wedding. On August 11, 1930, they were formally divorced in Reno, Nevada. Huguette cited desertion as the grounds. Gower, for his part, claimed the marriage had never been consummated. There were no children, no property settlement, no alimony. Reports from those who knew the couple suggested that Gower had been more interested in Huguette's bank account than her heart. Some believed he had been unfaithful. Others whispered that he had bragged about marrying into one of America's great fortunes. After the divorce, Huguette chose to be known as Mrs. Huguette Clark. She never remarried. For the rest of her life, 74 more years, she remained legally single, living first with her mother, and then, after Anna's death, entirely alone. She returned to the 12th floor apartment at 907 Fifth Avenue, where her mother had been living just 4 floors away, even during the brief marriage. The 2 women resumed their quiet existence. Huguette expanded her living space, adding apartments until she controlled 42 rooms across 2 floors. She filled her days with painting, music, and an ever-growing collection of dolls. She spoke French with the staff. She avoided public events. She stopped appearing in newspapers. By the late 1930s, she had vanished from society entirely. The marriage that had lasted 9 months would be her last attempt at what others might consider a normal life. For the next 33 years, she had only one companion: her mother. Chapter 7. The Death That Changed Everything. October 11, 1963, Anna Eugenia La Chapelle Clark died at age 85. She was buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx in the white marble family mausoleum beside her husband William and her daughter Andrée. Even though Huguette had known for several years that her mother's health was failing, the loss was wrenching. Huguette was 57 years old and had spent virtually every day of her adult life with Anna. During her brief 9-month marriage, her mother had lived only 4 floors away. The 2 women had lived through 2 world wars and the Great Depression together, protected and isolated by their millions. They had rarely been apart. Now, aside from her household employees, a housekeeper, maids, a chauffeur, Huguette was entirely on her own. The spacious apartments at 907 Fifth Avenue suddenly felt different. Rambling through 42 rooms alone, Huguette had to find a way to fill the hours she had once spent caring for Anna. She became, in effect, the curator of her own life. She wanted to preserve every remnant of family history, turning her apartments in Bellosguardo into personal museums dedicated to her parents and her lost sister. If furniture needed reupholstering, she demanded the exact same fabric that had been used when her mother had first decorated the space. Light bulbs had to be vintage, matching the era when Anna was alive. Anything related to her mother, she insisted, must be preserved exactly as it had been. Her daily routine became increasingly predictable. She painted in her studio. She watched television, developing a particular fondness for animated programs. She ate simply, preferring austere meals that required no preparation. She maintained her extensive doll collection, which now included pieces worth substantial sums. The dolls' dresses were kept impeccably ironed by the housekeeper. Huguette designed elaborate doll houses and worked on miniature pagodas with meticulous attention to detail. She had not felt the sun on her face for years. She had not walked outside for pleasure in longer than the staff could remember. The breeze, the seasons changing, the simple sensations of being in the world, all of it had become irrelevant to her. She was content in her enclosed space, speaking French to the few people she allowed near, preserving the past while the present moved on without her. For 28 years after her mother's death, Huguette lived this way, alone in 42 rooms. Then, in March 1991, she left, and she never came back. Chapter 8. The Hospital. The routine procedure was supposed to be brief. Huguette Clark, age 84, checked into Doctors Hospital on the Upper East Side of Manhattan in March 1991 for treatment of superficial skin cancer on her face. The lesions were removed successfully. Her physician, Dr. Henry Singman, strongly urged her to return home to her Fifth Avenue apartment. She refused. Huguette told hospital administrators she was perfectly happy and content to remain where she was. She transferred to an 11th floor room overlooking Central Park. She paid hundreds of thousands of dollars annually to stay, far more than the typical insurance reimbursement rate. Hospital officials were thrilled. Development staff flagged her as being worth $70 million with no immediate family. She was, in their eyes, a potential major donor. The hospital room became her entire world. It was simple, functional, and profoundly unlike the palatial spaces she owned. She watched animated programs for hours. During conversations with nurses and doctors, she often changed the subject to her favorite cartoons, topics that delighted her far more than discussions of her health or finances. She ate crackers and sardines. She drank warm milk brought by hospital workers. She made regular phone calls to a small circle of friends, but refused nearly all visitors. When Doctors Hospital merged with Beth Israel Medical Center, Huguette transferred with minimal disruption. She continued paying premium rates, and the hospital continued accommodating her unusual request. Her daily cost was $829. Over the years, that added up to hundreds of thousands annually, paid directly from her accounts without complaint. One person became essential to Huguette's hospital life. Hadassah Peri, a registered nurse from the Philippines, was assigned to Huguette by a home care agency shortly after her admission. Peri worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week for many years, before eventually reducing to 8-hour days. She saw Huguette virtually every day for nearly 20 years. The two women developed an extraordinarily close relationship. Huguette began giving Peri gifts almost immediately. The amounts were staggering. Over 2 decades, Peri received more than $31 million in cash, property, and assets. Huguette wrote checks for $5 million multiple times. She purchased houses for Peri's family, including one home that cost $525,000 and was 3 times the size of Peri's previous residence. She bought Peri a Bentley Arnage luxury sedan worth $200,000. She gave Peri a Stradivarius violin because Huguette remembered that Peri's son had once played the instrument, even though he had not touched it in years. Hospital staff watched these gifts with a mixture of astonishment and concern. Was this generosity or exploitation? Huguette also gave $10 million to her best friend. She gave $25,000 to hospital workers who fixed her television or brought her glasses of warm milk. Her accountant and attorney watched her fortune dwindle as she sold valuable assets, paintings, violins, property, to raise cash for more gifts. Despite being worth over $300 million, Huguette became what financial advisors would call cash poor. In 2006, when Huguette turned 100 years old, a neurologist visited her to assess her mental state. Many assumed that a century-old woman who had lived in a hospital for 15 years must be suffering from dementia or delusion. The neurologist was pleasantly surprised. He described her as sharp, engaged, and showing no signs of mental decline. Medical records from the period confirmed she remained capable of handling her own affairs. The hospital questioned whether her choice to stay was sane and rational. Legally, however, there was nothing they could do. She was competent, she had money, and she wanted to stay. Only once did anyone witness Huguette leave her room for something other than a medical procedure. After Hadassah Peri had surgery in the same hospital, Huguette walked down the hallway wearing high-heeled shoes to visit her nurse. Staff members were shocked. They had never seen her dressed up or moving through the building. She visited Peri, then returned to her room and resumed her isolated routine. As Peri later explained, Huguette preferred being inside. "That's how private she is," Peri said. For 20 years and 2 months, 7,364 nights, Huguette Clark lived in hospital rooms. Her palaces remained untouched. Chapter 9. The Empty Palaces. While Huguette lived in a single hospital room, small armies of workers maintained houses she would never see again. At Bellosguardo in Santa Barbara, the work never stopped. The estate required tens of thousands of dollars in monthly upkeep. Gardeners trimmed hedges and mowed lawns. Housekeepers dusted furniture that remained covered with custom slipcovers. The automobiles in the carriage house sat untouched, their registrations decades out of date. Dishes that had been washed in the 1990s were carefully stored, each piece dated and wrapped. Linens had been folded and sealed in brown paper by the housemen in the 1960s, each bundle signed and labeled. The estate manager lived on the grounds with his dogs. A family of foxes, now tame from years of human presence, hunted lizards near the reflecting pool, where 80-year-old orange trees continued to bear fruit. The roof developed small leaks over the decades, but otherwise the house remained in pristine condition. When Anna Clark's rose garden became too difficult to maintain, each variety of rosebush was carefully removed, its type recorded and its location mapped, in case anyone ever wanted to restore the garden to its original design. At 907 Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, Huguette's 3 apartments cost $28,500 a month in cooperative fees, $342,000 a year. The housekeeper arrived daily to maintain the 42 rooms. She kept the doll collection in perfect order, carefully ironing the dresses of the French and Japanese dolls so they would be ready if Huguette ever returned. The Impressionist paintings on the walls, Monet, Renoir, Degas, Sargent, remained exactly where Huguette had last seen them. The old rotary telephone still bore the exchange Butterfield 8. In New Canaan, Connecticut, the property called Le Beau Chateau sat on 52 wooded acres and featured a house of more than 14,000 square feet. Huguette had never visited it, not once. It, too, was maintained as if she might arrive at any moment. The staff managing these properties had devoted decades to their work. John C. Douglas III oversaw Bellosguardo from California. Tony Ruggiero managed the Connecticut estate. Chris Sadler took care of the New York apartments, maintaining Huguette's fine paintings and extensive collection. Some of these employees had not seen Huguette in more than 40 years. When reporter Bill Dedman visited Bellosguardo in 2010 to investigate the mystery, the estate's caretaker asked him a question that seemed absurd, but was entirely sincere. "Do you think she's still alive?" Shortly after Huguette moved to the hospital in 1991, a valuable pastel by Edgar Degas was stolen from her Fifth Avenue apartment. Danseuse faisant des pointes, dancer making points, was sold to the Peter Finlay Gallery and later acquired in 1993 by Henry W. Bloch, co-founder of H&R Block and a major art collector. The FBI did not begin investigating the theft until 2005. By 2007, they had informed Bloch that the painting had been reported stolen. In 2008, under a deed of gift, Clark agreed to donate the pastel, valued at $10 million, to the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City, where Bloch was a major benefactor. The mathematics of Huguette's life defied logic. Combined maintenance on her properties cost hundreds of thousands of dollars every year. The properties themselves were worth more than $200 million. Yet their owner lived in a single hospital room, eating crackers and sardines and giving away her fortune to nurses and friends. The houses waited. The staff waited. The foxes continued hunting by the reflecting pool at Bellosguardo. And in Manhattan, a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter began asking questions no one had thought to ask before. Chapter 10. The Investigation. In 2009, Bill Dedman was following a hunch. The NBC News investigative reporter had heard rumors about palatial estates sitting empty in California, Connecticut, and New York. When he began digging, he found something extraordinary. 3 properties worth more than $200 million were being meticulously maintained despite having no visible occupant. Someone was paying hundreds of thousands of dollars annually to preserve houses that appeared to be abandoned. Dedman tracked the ownership to Huguette Clark. She was 103 years old, one of the wealthiest women in America, and almost completely unknown. The last photograph of her dated back to around 1930. No one knew what she looked like now. Her relatives, 19 distant cousins descended from her father's first marriage, had not seen her in decades. Most had never met her at all. When Dedman discovered that Huguette was alive and living in a hospital, the story took on new dimensions. Why would someone with her resources choose a hospital room over a mansion? Who was managing her money? And were they managing it in her best interest? In August 2010, Manhattan District Attorney Cyrus Vance Jr. launched a criminal investigation into the handling of Huguette Clark's $300 million fortune. The probe was assigned to the Elder Abuse Unit, the same team that had prosecuted the high-profile Brooke Astor case. Investigators began examining the roles of Huguette's attorney, Wallace Bach, and her accountant, Irving Kamsler. Kamsler had a prior felony conviction, which raised additional concerns. The gifts Huguette had distributed were staggering. Nurse Hadassah Peri had received $31 million in cash, houses, cars, and other assets. Dr. Henry Singman, Huguette's longtime physician, had received $951,808 over 20 years. Hospital workers had been given $25,000 for minor tasks. Huguette's best friend had received $10 million. To fund these gifts, Huguette had been selling off valuable property and artwork, including Stradivarius violins and paintings by masters. Dedman's reporting for NBC became a sensation. The series of articles and photographs documenting Huguette's empty estates became the most popular feature in the history of the NBC News website, generating more than 110 million page views. The public was captivated. Here was a woman who embodied every paradox of extreme wealth. She owned everything but lived with nothing, valued privacy above all else, yet became the subject of intense scrutiny, and made choices that seemed incomprehensible to everyone watching from the outside. Huguette's distant relatives began to take notice. They had been sending her cards and notes for years, most of which went unanswered. Now they filed a guardianship petition, asking the court to appoint someone to oversee her affairs and protect her from potential exploitation. The petition was dismissed. Huguette, doctors confirmed, was mentally competent and entitled to make her own choices, no matter how unusual they seemed. On May 24, 2011, 2 weeks before her 105th birthday, Huguette Clark died at Beth Israel Medical Center. The questions surrounding her life were just beginning. Chapter 11. The 2 Wills, 6 weeks. That was how long it took Huguette Clark to change her mind about $300 million. In March 2005, at age 98, Huguette signed a will. It was simple and straightforward. She left $5 million to her nurse, Hadassah Peri. Everything else would go by default to her relatives, who were not named directly, but would inherit through standard intestacy laws. The will was legally sound and reflected what seemed like a reasonable distribution. Then, 6 weeks later in April 2005, Huguette signed a second will. This one was far more detailed and cut her relatives out entirely. The new will described Huguette as a, quote, 20, who, quote, 21. It distributed her fortune to those she trusted and causes she valued. Hadassah Peri was set to receive approximately $30 million plus Huguette's doll collection, valued at $1.7 million. Wanda Steika, Huguette's goddaughter, would receive $12 million. Attorney Wallace Bach and accountant Irving Kamsler would each receive $500,000. Beth Israel Medical Center would get $1 million. Chris Sattler, her personal assistant, would receive $370,000. Various property managers and employees would receive smaller amounts. The newly created Bellosguardo Foundation would inherit the Santa Barbara estate along with $8 million in her art collection. The Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington would receive her Monet painting from the Water Lilies series, which she had purchased in 1930. The will stated emphatically that none of her money should go to her relatives. 19 of those relatives disagreed. All of them were descended from William Andrews Clark's first marriage. Most had never met Huguette. The last time any of them had seen her was in 1957, 54 years earlier. Over the decades, however, many had sent her cards and small notes. Some wrote regularly at Christmas and birthdays. She never responded, though she kept many of the cards. After Huguette's death, the relatives filed a legal challenge claiming she had lacked mental capacity when she signed the second will. They argued that she had been subjected to undue influence by her nurse, attorney, and accountant. They claimed fraud. They questioned the validity of the signing ceremony. Above all, they raised concerns about elder abuse. Had Huguette been isolated from her family and manipulated by people who stood to gain millions? The defense pointed to medical records from 2005, just 6 months after Huguette signed her final will. Medical reports showed she remained mentally sharp and capable of managing her own decisions. The neurologist's evaluation from 2006 confirmed she was functioning well, despite her advanced age. Telephone recordings and correspondence demonstrated that she remained articulate and lucid well into her final years. Wallace Bach, her attorney, insisted that Huguette was not a spoiled child, but a strong-willed woman who made her own decisions. She had chosen to live in the hospital. She had chosen to give away her fortune. She had chosen to exclude relatives she had never known. Were those choices unusual? Absolutely. They were, however, hers. The Manhattan District Attorney's investigation continued in parallel with the civil case. 60 attorneys became involved. The media coverage was intense. Huguette's life, which she had spent decades hiding, was now exposed in court filings, depositions, and news reports. The stakes were enormous. Over $300 million, 3 magnificent properties, a world-class art collection, Stradivarius violins, a first edition of Walt Whitman's quote, 23, an extensive doll collection, and the legacy of one of the last great Gilded Age families. As jury selection approached in September 2013, no one wanted the trial to proceed. Too many secrets would be revealed. Too much damage would be done. In the middle of the night, attorneys began making calls. A settlement had to be reached, and it had to happen before the trial began. Chapter 12. The Settlement. The document was signed in the middle of the night and delivered to Surrogate Judge Nora S. Anderson on Tuesday morning. Jury selection had been scheduled to resume that day. Instead, the judge accepted the settlement, and the trial ended before it began. The agreement had been brokered by the Office of New York Attorney General Eric Schneiderman, whose Charities Bureau had worked aggressively to protect the interests of charitable beneficiaries while ensuring that those in confidential relationships with Huguette received nothing from her estate. The relatives received $34.5 million collectively. The estate also paid their taxes and covered $11.5 million in legal fees, bringing the total distribution to roughly $46 million. In a statement, they expressed gratitude and emphasized that their primary motivation had been, quote, 24. By removing Wallace Bach and Irving Kamsler from their roles as executors and requiring Hadassah Peri to return money, the relatives argued the settlement sent a message that those entrusted with the care of the elderly would be held accountable. For Hadassah Peri, the settlement was devastating. She received nothing from the will. She was required to return $5 million of the $31 million in lifetime gifts Huguette had given her. She renounced her claim to the Japanese doll collection and returned some jewelry that had been Clark family heirlooms. The advantage for Peri was that the settlement stopped any further attempts to claw back more of the gifts she had already received. She was allowed to keep approximately $26 million, including the Bentley, 5 properties in the tri-state area, and various other assets. In a statement read by her attorney, the Peri family expressed happiness to contribute to resolving the litigation _25 Wallace Bach and Irving Kamsler forfeited their $500,000 bequests. They were removed as executors of the estate and lost their appointments as trustees of the Bellosguardo Foundation, positions that would have entitled them to significant ongoing fees. However, they avoided criminal charges and could claim a form of vindication. In April 2014, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office quietly closed its investigation without filing any charges against anyone. Documents and testimony had backed up the men's story. They had been carrying out Huguette's wishes, not manipulating her. Beth Israel Medical Center received the $1 million specified in the will, but with a condition. The Clark family, the Bellosguardo Foundation, and the Corcoran Gallery were permitted to sue the hospital to attempt to recover additional money. During Huguette's 20-year stay, hospital officials had mounted what one report described as a, quote, 26 to persuade her to make large donations. Development office memos flagged her as being worth $70 million with no immediate family, making her an ideal donor prospect. The Bellosguardo Foundation was established, but not in California as Huguette's will had specified. Instead, it was registered in New York State, with the board formed under the guidance of the New York Attorney General. One seat went to a representative of the relatives who had challenged the will, Ian Devine, a great-grandnephew. Another went to a representative from the former Corcoran Gallery of Art, which the Clark family had supported for generations. A third went to Huguette's attorney in Santa Barbara. The remaining board members were nominated by the mayor of Santa Barbara and chosen by the Attorney General. Approximately $25 million in legal fees were included in the settlement. 60 attorneys had been involved in the case. The battle for Huguette Clark's fortune had consumed years, generated national headlines, and exposed the most private details of a deeply private woman's life. The settlement accomplished something important. It combined elements from both of Huguette's wills. The relatives received money, though not through the second will's provisions. The Bellosguardo Foundation was created, fulfilling Huguette's wish to promote the arts, and those in confidential relationships, the nurse, attorney, and accountant, received nothing from the will, addressing concerns about undue influence. The battle for Huguette Clark's fortune was over. Bellosguardo itself, however, remained frozen, waiting for one more transformation. Chapter 13. Bellosguardo Awakens. For 7 years after Huguette's death, Bellosguardo remained exactly as she had left it. The legal battles over her estate had to be resolved before the property could be transferred to the new foundation. During that time, the maintenance continued. Staff arrived daily. The grounds were tended. The house was preserved. Tens of thousands of dollars a month kept flowing from the estate's accounts to ensure that nothing changed. In 2013, the settlement created the Bellosguardo Foundation with a clear mission: foster and promote the arts. The practical question remained. What did that mean? The board faced difficult decisions. Should the estate become a traditional museum with permanent collections? Should it host art installations and rotating exhibitions? Should it serve as a performance venue? Should it be open to the public for tours? The answer eventually was all of the above. In 2018, 7 years after Huguette's death, the property was finally transferred to the foundation. Preparation began immediately. Furniture that had been covered for 70 years was uncovered. The pieces were pristine, frozen in time, as if the family had left just yesterday. Linens that had been wrapped in brown paper since the 1960s were carefully unwrapped. Dishes that had been washed and stored in the 1990s were brought out. Structural assessments were conducted. The city of Santa Barbara had to approve a conditional use permit before large-scale public access could begin. In January 2020, the foundation held a public auction of Huguette's doll collection, which had grown to be worth more than $1 million. The sale raised nearly $2 million for the foundation's endowment. Selected dolls were retained for permanent display at Bellosguardo, preserving the collection that had meant so much to Huguette, while also generating funds to support the foundation's mission. Finally, in 2023, Bellosguardo opened its doors to the public. The initial tours were small and docent-led, restricted to the first floor while the foundation awaited additional permits to open the second floor. Tickets were released periodically via an email list and sold out almost immediately. Visitors eager to see inside the mysterious mansion that had been closed for so long lined up for the rare opportunity. What they found was extraordinary. The high-ceilinged foyer opened onto the main hall, which stretched toward each wing and revealed views of the reflecting pool where 80-year-old orange trees still stood. Family portraits lined the walls. William Clark in his later years, Anna in her prime, young Huguette, and Andrée, forever 17. The two European rooms that had been transported from the family's New York properties remained intact. The reception room's exquisite paneling and painted muslin ceiling looked as refined as the day they were installed. The dining room's painted canvas ceiling and antique chairs seemed ready for a formal dinner that would never come. The most moving space was Huguette's art studio. 40 of her paintings hung on the walls, including several self-portraits. Visitors could see the young woman in a Japanese print dress staring out from the canvas, her face recognizable from photographs taken in the 1920s and 30s. French and Japanese dolls sat lifelike on their doll-sized chairs, dressed in the clothing that the housekeeper had kept so carefully ironed for decades. The foundation's vision extended beyond tours. Plans included art installations featuring works from institutions around the world, musical performances on the lawn, educational programs, and cultural events. Families would be invited to picnic by the restored rose garden. The estate that Huguette had wanted kept private would become a dynamic venue for the arts, fulfilling her wishes in a way she perhaps never imagined. The irony was inescapable. Huguette had been so private that she once bought every aerial postcard showing Bellosguardo to prevent the public from seeing even a photograph of the property. Now the public was welcomed inside, walking through rooms she had abandoned decades earlier, seeing paintings she had created in solitude, and learning about a woman who had spent her entire life hiding from exactly this kind of attention. The foundation had honored her primary wish. The arts were being promoted. The property was being preserved, and Bellosguardo, after 60 years of silence, was alive again. The mansion that stood empty for 6 decades now welcomed strangers. The woman who hid from the world created a gift for it. Chapter 15. The Last Heiress. Bellosguardo sits above the Pacific exactly as Anna Clark imagined it. The 23 acres overlook East Beach. The reflecting pool mirrors the California sky. The orange trees, now more than 80 years old, still bear fruit. Foxes still hunt lizards in the garden where roses once grew in careful patterns. The view remains breathtaking. 360 degrees of ocean, mountains, and a city that has grown up around the estate, while the estate itself refused to change. What Huguette Clark left behind is more than property. It is a question that refuses to be answered. What does wealth mean when you own everything but live with nothing? What does privacy mean when you isolate yourself so completely that even your own reflection becomes a stranger? The paradoxes define her legacy. She owned 3 palaces and chose a hospital room. She desperately guarded her privacy, yet became the subject of books, investigations, and international fascination. She hoarded possessions in apartments she never visited while giving away tens of millions to people who brought her warm milk. She feared strangers, yet trusted her nurse so completely that she made Hadassah Peri one of the highest-paid caregivers in human history. She wanted Bellosguardo preserved exactly as her mother had left it, yet her own will ensured it would become a public monument. Who was Huguette Clark? The evidence offers only fragments. She was a painter who created self-portraits no one saw for decades, a musician who played harp and violin for no audience, a collector who displayed nothing, an heiress who lived like a hermit, a daughter who never escaped the orbit of her mother's influence, even 30 years after Anna's death. A woman who found more joy in animated cartoons at age 100 than most people find in entire lifetimes. What we know is limited. She was born on June 9, 1906, into the scandal and splendor of the Gilded Age. She was raised in a 121-room palace on Fifth Avenue, surrounded by Rembrandts and Renoir, educated at the finest schools, and given every advantage wealth could provide. She married briefly at 22, divorced at 24, and never sought companionship again. She lost her sister at 13 and her mother at 57, both losses carving absences she tried to fill with preservation and repetition. She lived to 104 in a hospital room, dying just 2 weeks before what would have been her 105th birthday. What we do not know is everything that matters. Why did she choose a hospital over palaces? What did she think about during those 20 years of self-imposed exile? Was she happy? Did she dream? Did she have regrets? The medical records tell us she was competent, lucid, and engaged. They do not tell us what it felt like to be Huguette Clark, watching the world from a hospital window while her mansions waited in silence. The legal battle over her estate changed discussions about elder law and undue influence. The settlement distributed more than $300 million among relatives, charities, and former employees. The Bellosguardo Foundation now promotes the arts in her name, hosting exhibitions and concerts that draw visitors from around the world. 2 best-selling books have been written about her life. An HBO series is in development. Countless articles and documentaries have tried to solve the mystery of the reclusive heiress. The 19 relatives who challenged her will receive their $34.5 million and contributed a board member to the foundation that preserves the family's legacy. They speak of continuing, quote, 27 Hadassah Peri kept $26 million in gifts, lost $30 million from the will, and returned $5 million to the estate. Whether her service was devotion or exploitation remains debated. She worked nearly 20 years caring for a woman who had everything yet wanted only companionship and simple pleasures. Tours of Bellosguardo do not answer why. Documents explaining the legal settlement do not explain the choice. Medical records confirming competence do not illuminate motivation. Visitors walk through Huguette's studio and see her paintings on the walls. They see self-portraits of a young woman in a Japanese dress, her face familiar from photographs taken nearly a century ago. Her eyes stare back from the canvas, revealing nothing. The mystery remains intact. We see what she owned. We know what she gave away. We understand the mechanics of her fortune and the structure of her isolation. We do not know who she was. A woman who owned palaces and chose hospitals. A fortune spent on empty rooms and grateful strangers. A mystery that money could not buy and death did not solve. Bellosguardo endures, not as Huguette's prison, but as her final gift.